Hello and welcome to my presentation. My name is Carys Dickens and this presentation is called Teaching Beneath and Beyond the Syllabus. This presentation is about my research called Exploring Potential Approaches to Teaching Tap Dance in an ISTD Syllabus Teaching Context, a Critical Consideration of Challenges of Historical Constructs and Lack of Representation. In a nutshell, this research aimed to explore how decolonisation approaches in higher education institutions, such as dance colleges and conservatoires, can be applied within private sector dance schools, particularly those following the Imperial Society of Teachers of Dancing tap dance syllabus. I teach in ISTD dance schools and have done so for nearly a decade now, and I, like many ISTD dance teachers, grew up learning the ISTD syllabus, similar to my students. So this presentation is to guide ISTD tap dance teachers through what was explored in this project and how these findings can be implemented in ISTD tap dance classes. Before I discuss decolonisation further and how it transpires within dance education, let's look at some statistics from the Tired Movement's RED research project. The Tired Movement is based in the UK and supports inclusion within dance education, and their RED research project is an ongoing study looking into the representation of non-white or global majority students. They found that less than 20% of dance college intakes are of the global majority. They also looked at dance societies similar to the ISTD. The Royal Academy of Dance website claims to have a panel of over 200 examiners with their photo images displayed online. Not one of them is black. There are 22 board directors pictured on the IDTA, International Dance Teachers Association website. Not one of them is black. Use these figures to reflect on your dance setting. You could think about what the rough percentage of non-white students or faculty at your institution is. You could even think back to your dance or dance teacher training too. Pause if you need to. In my classes, I calculated 5%, so this is way below the 20% global majority discovered by Tired Movement and isn't representative of the general population either, which is 18.3% non-white according to government statistics. When I calculated this figure, I found it quite upsetting, and it reaffirmed that looking at inclusion within our private sector dance schools is really important. This is a powerful statement by Donna and highlights how educational institutions are often dominated by white educators, which the statistics on representation by Tired Movement appear to confirm. So, what is decolonisation? Have a little think, pause the presentation if needed, and jot down any thoughts about what decolonisation is or anything you know already. If this is nothing, don't worry, I was in the same position before my master's studies. Decolonisation involves the decentering of Eurocentrism in education. So this means taking the emphasis and importance of things that signify whiteness and instead valuing diverse cultural practices to provide a more inclusive space for students of colour. In dance education, decolonisation can be encouraged by diversifying curriculum content and giving dance subjects equal weight to promote inclusion. Most dance departments place the most importance on ballet, which perpetuates Eurocentrism because it upholds a historically white aesthetic. So as educators, we need to look past the common trope that ballet is the foundation of all dance. So, if we are to discentre Eurocentrism in dance education and its focus on ballet and white dance aesthetics, what role can tap dance play in decolonising dance schools? First, I'd like you to pause and write down what you know about the history of tap dance. Tap dance was greatly influenced by the African diaspora, or the slave trade in America. As you can see, through the 1600s to 1800s, interactions between Afro-Irish communities in the Caribbean and America formed the beginnings of tap dance. Because of its great historical influences stemming from the African diaspora and African Americans, tap dance traditionally is synonymous with black dance aesthetics. Looking at the characteristics of black dance aesthetics further, tap dance was traditionally taught in a social manner through imitation, assimilation, and transformation of movements. It was about exchanging movements and rhythms and was spontaneous and competitive. Hill illustrates the stylistic movement characteristics of bodies bent at the waist, knees flexed, and arms flying out to the side. And now looking at the music and rhythmical influences and how they intersected with tap dance, Welsh Asante argues polyrhythms are one of the key aesthetics of African dance styles, and that music and movement are interconnected. The history and aesthetics of tap dance signify African influences. Therefore, many researchers and educators in the field argue that tap dance can support a diversified curriculum, steering away from the Eurocentrism of ballet and therefore supporting decolonisation. Now, here's another chance to reflect on your practice. I'd like you to pause now and think about whether these black dance aesthetics are evident in what you teach, i.e. the syllabus material, and how you teach it. If you're thinking you can't see much of this within your practice, then you wouldn't be alone. Let's look at how a tap syllabus may be in discordance with the historical influences of tap dance. Crawford recognises how the codification or the creation of a syllabus homogenizes or simplifies tap dance into uniform steps that are easy to repeat. This repetition of the same choreographies is contradictory to the exploratory exchange symbolic of the African American historical influences on tap dance. In Eurocentric dance institutions, diverse cultural dance styles can often be adapted through the lens of balletic stylistic features, again assuming balletic technique as the one and only definition of technique. For example, the upright posture, lifted feeling through the legs and feet, and rounded continuous arm lines associated with ballet technique are often applied to tap dance, removing the black dance aesthetics. This could be described as whitewashing. Therefore, this would suggest that tap dance syllabi, like the ISTD, can strip tap dance of its historical African American influences in what and how it is taught. I hope that by looking briefly at the history of tap and existing dance education literature, the importance of decolonisation is evident to avoid stripping tap dance of its historically black dance aesthetics. During my reading for this research, it became evident to me that there is a gap in the literature when it comes to our settings in private sector dance schools. Therefore, I hope this research begins to fill that gap and contribute to the progression of quality education in ISTD dance schools. Also, being a white dance educator, this influenced the rationale for this research because I wanted to see what white educators could do to improve the inclusion of global majority students in dance education. Dissinger acknowledges that ideally diverse cultural dance styles should be taught by cultural bearers. However, McCarthy-Brown recognises that a lack of resources such as diverse teaching faculty may impact decolonisation, so there may not always be cultural bearers available within faculties to teach diverse dance styles. Therefore, if white teachers are teaching these dance styles, it's important that we are sensitive towards the history of these dance styles and the intersections with race and the racism experienced by African Americans in tap dance's history. West argues that white educators hold a powerful position towards social change. Therefore, I think it's important that white educators are sensitive to their position, not having had a lived experience as an African American. We should use every opportunity to do what we can to support the inclusion and increased representation of global majority students within dance education. Tourism methods. I chose the qualitative research methodology due to the exploratory, fluid and flexible, data-driven and context-sensitive nature of a qualitative research paradigm. Being context-sensitive was particularly important to me because this research aims to address a gap in the literature within the context in which I teach. Also, the fluid and flexible approach of qualitative research was important to value the subjective views and thoughts of my students. Practice-based action research supports the explorative and context-sensitive characteristics of a qualitative research paradigm. The research involved 2 times 1 hour workshop dance classes entitled Tap Dance History, with 10 of my current intermediate and advanced 1 tap students. I created a presentation that followed key points on a timeline of tap dance history. We discussed historical contexts, stylistic movement characteristics, and music. Students engaged in non-syllabus learning activities such as improvised warm-ups, rhythmical exploration tasks, and group choreographic tasks. Lots of video resources were shared with students to reference famous African-American tap dancers such as Bilbo Jangles Robinson, the Nicholas Brothers, and Gregory Hines. Some examples of the slides from the presentation are shown here. I used purposive sampling to recruit the student participants to complement the qualitative research paradigm and answer the research questions. Students were given a questionnaire before and after the workshops to gain data about the knowledge they had gained from this project, what they found beneficial about the experience, and what they would like to explore further. The questionnaires were constructed to provide mostly open-ended answers to gain qualitatively rich and subjective data. I also made field notes to support this data and note any emerging ideas. Many ethical considerations were made in the creation of this research, guided by the BERA Ethical Guidelines for Educational Research 2024. The age of the students required particular considerations. Firstly, parental consent was mandatory. Secondly, the timetabling of the classes so as not to overwhelm the students who already have a lot of commitments with schoolwork and their existing dance classes. Finally, as their teacher, it was important students didn't feel coerced to participate. The best interests of the students were paramount. Participant information sheets were supplied to participants aged 18 plus and parents of students aged under 18. Participant information sheets informed participants and parents of what the study would involve and how data were to be collected, stored, and destroyed. Data were collected in line with GDPR and the Data Protection Act to ensure data were collected and stored safely. Consent forms were stored in a locked filing cabinet and electronic forms in a password-protected folder, both of which I am the sole person who has access to this data. All questionnaires were collected anonymously, and the students' names were pseudonymized in the dissemination of the findings. Data were analysed thematically following the 6-step coding procedure of Braun and Clark to produce themes that supported a qualitative research paradigm. Through the process of thematic analysis, I constructed a theme entitled Teaching Beneath and Beyond the Syllabus, as per the title of this presentation, that encourages teachers to teach students the history beneath the syllabus and to look beyond what is specified in the syllabus. I then identified 3 sub-themes that were class content approaches: improvisation, non-syllabus choreography, and historical dialogue. We're going to look at 2 of these findings, improvisation and historical dialogue, through the lens of the teacher as a co-learner to support ISTD teachers in implementing these findings. Dissinger argued white dance teachers must always position themselves as co-learners with their students. Dissinger's article explores the experience of white dance educators who are committed to providing culturally responsive education for students. As a white dance educator, I really related to this article throughout this research and believe it beneficial for ISTD dance teachers to explore situating ourselves as co-learners when engaging with decolonisation and the findings of this research. Improvisation was a key characteristic of the African American historical influences on tap dance, stemming from African American religious rituals that were circular, percussive, and rhythmical, with repetitive singing, chanting, and dancing. Now, if we compare that to improvisation, how it is done in an ISTD setting, improvisation is in a very prescribed format, where students stand in a line and often improvise to a short 4 to 8 count rhythm set by the examiner. Then, suddenly, advanced 1 and 2 students are expected to improvise for a minute, which I've always thought is a massive jump. Compared to the historical influences on tap dance, the ISTD setting seems to be systematic and restrictive, lacking the spontaneity and social characteristics. Crawford recognised this in her study on ISTD tap and noticed the lack of individual expression because there are few opportunities to improvise freely. So, to explore improvisation in a way that was characteristic of African American influences in the workshop classes, we did a warm-up that was in a circle. I started with improvising 4 counts of sound with my feet, body percussion, and vocalized sound. Then, together, we would repeat this combination several times in a call and response format characteristic of African American tap dance influences. Then we went round the circle and the next student would do their own 4 counts, and so on and so forth. We did this to African drum music to explore the syncopated rhythms symbolic of African musical influences on tap dance. Let's now look at the questionnaire responses from the students about improvisation. When questioned about the stylistic qualities of African American tap dance influences students had learned about through the research project, Adele said there was a lot more improvisation in a group setting, and they all cheered each other on, creating an upbeat, high-energy atmosphere. We still do improvisation now in tap, but not in the same way they did. It's now more formal. This suggests that not only did these improvisation exercises provide a learning opportunity about the history of tap dance, but the description of an upbeat, high-energy atmosphere suggests it was more enjoyable too. On what students would like to include more of, Morella said, I think more varied music, example, drums. Students recognise the value of varying the music used, and I would suggest that they took great rhythmical inspiration from the drum music. Cruz Banks argues that decolonising dance pedagogies requires us to include indigenous and diaspora systems of thought, so using music styles characteristic of African American influences can uphold the history of tap dance. I would like to look at 2 keywords I would suggest to support the teacher as a co-learner: exploration and vulnerability. As an ISTD syllabus teacher, I can see how teachers could get stuck in a cycle of just playing the same syllabus music week in, week out for classes, which I suggest can contribute to rote learning. Therefore, exploring and incorporating music styles characteristic of African American influences on tap dance will probably require a deep dive into streaming music libraries. Drum music, jazz and ragtime all played a part in the history of tap dance. I suggest that not only will incorporating these different music styles will encourage us as teachers to expand our musical knowledge, but will also support students' musical knowledge by expanding their musical and rhythmical experiences beyond the repetition of the syllabus and rote learning music. This situates us as co-learners with our students as we both expand our learning beyond just tap dance by increasing musical knowledge, again, learning beyond the syllabus. Now, vulnerability. Similarly to Salfran's students in her study, if I were asked to improvise for a prolonged period, this would fill me with dread. My experience with tap improvisation is limited to the formats within the ISTD syllabus that I learned as a student. Therefore, I can sympathise with students when they feel like this too. I would argue that we do not do enough improvisation in a relaxed format for students to find it achievable or enjoyable. I wrote in my field notes that Valentina commented that if teachers or examiners participated in a warm-up like the one we did in the project, she would find improvisation more enjoyable and feel much more relaxed for the class ahead, which I think is a great suggestion. Whilst I cannot control what examiners do in ISTD examinations, I can incorporate more improvisation myself, which I think does require vulnerability if teachers feel unconfident with improvisation like I do. Sharing vulnerable moments like this with students can situate us as co-learners and hopefully lead to learning that is enjoyable for all in a safe environment. I would suggest that improvisational learning activities can provide opportunities to expand students' movement vocabulary and knowledge, thus teaching beyond the syllabus whilst maintaining the historical influences beneath. Miller argues that tap teachers must have an in-depth knowledge of tap dance history. So I'd like you to reflect on your training as a student and teacher and think about when you have been taught about the history of tap dance. If you're struggling to think of a time, then your experiences are similar to mine. Crawford acknowledges that historical knowledge is not required in an ISTD tap dance examination for students, and from my experience, nor for teachers either. To facilitate historical dialogue, the class content in the workshop classes were mixed content-wise between dialogue and practical learning activities. As discussed previously, technology was utilised to explore famous African American tap dancers through different key points in the timeline of tap dance history. The images show some of the slides that I created from the workshop classes. It would appear that students found exploring famous African American tap dancers and historical dialogue a valuable experience. Some have suggested that learning activities exploring famous dancers could be incorporated in classes more. Choose a famous dancer and create a piece using their stylistic qualities. And Carmen said, more famous dancers, as I found this both interesting and inspirational. Watching YouTube videos of famous dancers provided a reference point for stylistic movement characteristics and also allowed us to enter into dialogue about what these performers may have experienced in terms of racism at the times they were performing. This led to further discussions about important issues in dance education, such as Eurocentrism and marginalisation. Historical dialogue and discussion are important alongside rehearsal. Estelle, one of the student participants, suggested during the discussion that we explore famous dancers as we learn new syllabus content. Coincidentally, Miller suggests referencing the history of the tap steps as we teach them to provide important historical context for young tap dancers. To situate ourselves as co-learners with our students, I'd like to look at the two key words again, exploration and vulnerability. Exploration. If, like me, prior to this project, your knowledge about the history of tap dance is limited, increasing historical knowledge will likely take some exploration beyond the syllabus. We need to ensure that we aren't looking at history through a Eurocentric lens of whiteness, because students will often be familiar with Fred Astaire and or Gene Kelly, but to support decolonisation, I would suggest exploring African American dancers helps to maintain Black dance aesthetics. Vulnerability. In discussing race, white educators may be concerned about misrepresentation. This is a legitimate concern that I can sympathise with because I felt it myself during this project. However, if we do avoid addressing issues related to race, then we are perpetuating whiteness and Eurocentrism. Barr and Oliver argue that incorporating historical dialogue is a marker of quality education, and as discussed earlier, West argues that white educators hold great power to invoke social change from within their classroom. Therefore, we must use this power positively. This was a small-scale study that I think could benefit from further research to broaden the data collected and see what works well in other dance schools and possibly with other dance examination boards too. I think it could benefit from being undertaken with participants who aren't my students to avoid students feeling coerced to participate in a certain way. Although the research was designed to avoid that where possible, it's impossible to say whether students did feel coerced or not. In conclusion, I found the research to be an interesting and valuable experience. My students exceeded my expectations and really engaged with the project with open minds. I felt it helped me grow as an educator too. We worked together and, as co-learners, learned a lot. So I would highly recommend explorations like this for other ISTD dance teachers. This research was not intended to devalue the ISTD syllabus, but more to enrich and enhance students' learning. If dance teachers could find time to schedule workshop classes like this or extend the length of classes to allow time for these learning activities, I think it would be beneficial. As discussed, the themes to think about including are improvisation that is informal, fun and high energy, exploring African American music styles and rhythms. Historical dialogue, incorporating famous African American tap dancers and discussing the racism they may have experienced. Some themes weren't able to fit within the scope of this presentation were non-syllabus choreography, exploring the characteristic movement styles of African American tap dance influences to uphold Black dance aesthetics. Also, another idea that emerged that could be developed further in future research was curriculum design. Thinking beyond the norm about other ways to enrich and enhance learning could be watching performances, going to workshops or classes outside of the dance school, or inviting guest teachers with significant experience with the African American influences on tap dance to the dance school. I would also recommend that dance teachers engage with current research to stay informed about progressive practices that are emerging in the field. Research often explores practices that are implemented in formal education, and it would seem rarely the private dance school. Therefore, we can use research in informal settings to enhance the educational experience within private sector dance schools. Through all of these themes and suggestions, positioning ourselves as co-learners through exploration and vulnerability could lead to impactful change for ourselves as well as our students. Overall, I believe we as teachers could use the title of this presentation as a motto for how to approach tap dance and decolonizing private sector dance schools. Teaching students beneath and beyond the syllabus could be a valuable way to enhance and enrich student learning while hopefully supporting greater inclusion and representation of students and teachers of the global majority within the private sector dance school. Thank you for watching. The following slides show the references for this presentation.